think the technology is working. Well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me extend to you a very warm welcome to this public affairs event tonight, which is a very special one. This is the centenary lecture tonight, which is the centenary of the Royal Overseas League, ROSL as we call it, being granted a royal charter, obviously, in 1922, though it was founded in 1910. So it is a very special occasion, and I hope you will not only enjoy our guest speaker tonight, Andrew Roberts, the legendary historian, but also let me just make a couple of administrative announcements. The first of those is that at the end of the discussion, which we'll devote about an hour to, and that will be me having a discussion with Andrew, and then you being able to put questions to him about anything you like, because I'm sure he can handle any question, particularly questions about history. And after that, so at about 7:30, there is a champagne reception, which is above us in the Hall of India and Pakistan. So not only will you be able to have your glass of champagne, but you will also have Andrew there, who will be signing his book for you as you buy it, and you have to buy it, on Lord Northcliffe. So let me get to Andrew Roberts. So all of you will have heard of Andrew Roberts as one of this country's and the English-speaking world's most celebrated historians. A man who has made his name writing the history of war, of course. I think that's where you sort of first started to make your name. But above all, has written what 13 different newspapers have described as the greatest single-volume biography of Winston Churchill. But has written a great biography of Napoleon, other books, but importantly tonight he has written a biography of Lord Northcliffe, who I think I would describe as an Australian as very much the Rupert Murdoch of his era. And his personality seems a bit like Rupert Murdoch's as well, having read your book. But it's very kind of Andrew to come along here tonight, particularly as this is this period in history now, which I think you will remember, by the way. At least you'll remember the politics for many years to come. But this period in history is particularly important to him personally, because 3 days ago he was elevated to the House of Lords. And for that you deserve very warm congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And it's, thank you. For all the criticism and the cynicism there is about some of the appointments, or not that there has been this time, but over the years, some of the appointments to the House of Lords, this is an appointment which will be universally applauded, and it is entirely appropriate. So, Andrew, welcome.
Thank you.
My lord. You'll have to get used to that. But I think you will.
I think I will very quickly, yes.
First of all, we're going to focus very much on your latest book, the biography of Lord Northcliffe, which I haven't read every page of it, but I've read big chunks of it. And
did you cut out the sex scenes? He had lots of mistresses, Lord Northcliffe, and it was extremely...
No, I hunted for the sex scenes.
You read this, okay, fair enough. Yeah.
So it's a nice racing book. It is an incredibly interesting book about somebody who perhaps we don't talk about so much today, but who was a huge figure in his time. As I said, he was very much the Rupert Murdoch of his era. How is that for an introduction, Andrew?
I think that's fair, not least because actually Rupert Murdoch's father, Keith Murdoch, was one of Northcliffe's protégés. In fact, he was so close to Lord Northcliffe that he was nicknamed Lord Southcliffe. And Rupert Murdoch, who helped me with this book, remembered being told stories about Lord Northcliffe by his father. who lived to a great age. So there is a connection. There's a family connection. There's a business connection because Lord Northcliffe actually helped finance the buying of the Sydney Morning Post, which was one of Keith Murdoch's earliest papers. And so there very much is a connection. But what you're referring to, of course, is the idea of a tremendously powerful press magnate who, through the power of his newspapers, is able to affect policy and be a key power broker in the world. And that is also true, of course. In fact, it's far more true of Lord Northcliffe than it is of Rupert Murdoch, because Lord Northcliffe didn't have to operate in the same environment as Rupert Murdoch, where you have a monopolies commission. So you get to the stage by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, where Lord Northcliffe actually controls the Times, the Daily Mail, the Observer, and the Daily Mirror, and also about 400 other papers, regional papers, in Britain and around the world, to the point that he actually controls 40% of the circulation of British press at the time of the outbreak of the First World War. An extraordinary accumulation of power that, frankly, Rupert Murdoch could only dream of.
No, in Australia, Rupert Murdoch would control something like 65% of all newspapers.
Because you don't run the Monopolies Commission,
we do. We had a Trade Practices Commission. However, this is the point I'm getting to. In 1914, the public only had one source, really, didn't they, of media. So he controlled 40% of the one source of media.
You mean newspapers?
That's right.
Yes.
So there's no television or radio.
There's no television or radio.
Internet or anything.
Exactly. And so this absolutely key medium of newspapers was the one that he had this 40% holding on. And in a sense, he was a journalist all his life. He grew up in genteel poverty. He was born in Chapelizod, just outside Dublin. And his parents were very poor. His father, poor in a middle class sense. They still had a maid, but nonetheless, they were, his father was an alcoholic barrister. His mother had 15 children. That in itself was likely to sort of tip you over into poverty. The mother actually wrapped up her children in newspapers to keep them warm. Ironically enough, newspapers, really, when one comes to think of it, because of course...
that may be an idea for this winter, then.
Then Alfred Armsworth, later Lord Northcliffe, grew up, therefore, absolutely certain and insistent that he was not going to have to face poverty in his lifetime. He didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge, which is what his father wanted him to do. He went into journalism because he thought he could see the way of making a great fortune in journalism. And what he spotted was that in the 1870 Education Act, the Forster Education Act, suddenly, for the first time in British history, millions of ordinary working class people could read and write for the first time. And they wanted to buy, actually what they wanted to buy at the beginning was magazines, but he also got them to buy newspapers, partly by cutting the price. His newspapers cost a halfpenny, whereas most other ones cost a penny. The Times cost threepence. And he also made newspapers interesting to read, entertaining to read. Before Northcliffe, you had these newspapers that were enormous, that they had no paragraphing. They just said what every MP had said in the House of Commons the day before, and that was pretty much it. What he did was to invent the paragraph, essentially, and eye-catching headlines and interesting information, which is also entertaining. And by the 1880s, he was able, the mid-1890s, he was able to sell 1 million copies of his magazines per day, which was the largest circulation of any newspaper empire in the world, even bigger than what Hearst and Pulitzer and those giants were doing over in America. So he was a revolutionary in that sense, and the money that came in was absolutely astonishing.
So he was, see, I'm drawing this analogy the whole time with Rupert Murdoch. and I'm interested in that he knew and supported Keith Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch's father, and you've spoken to Rupert Murdoch about Northcliffe, I guess. But he did one of the things that Murdoch did when Murdoch came here, and that was to get and use his instinctive sense of the public opinion and public taste and cater to that as you would if you were running a business. And Northcliffe, in his early years, he really popularised newspapers, I suppose, by making them, as you just described, interesting, readable, a bit gossipy, I suppose, and very opinionated.
Yes, what he said about the Daily Mail, which he founded in 1896, was that three things sell newspapers. Money things, health things, and sex things. And if you look at the Daily Mail today, essentially, that key role in information and entertainment is exactly the same. He got it right. People do want to read about those things. And what a lot of the other newspapers at the time did, and to a lesser extent I think even today do, is to try to mould the public taste, to tell people what they should be reading, to sort of make them have a more sophisticated diet of news. Actually, what he believed was that people should be able to read what they were genuinely interested in. And so you did get lots of stuff about the royals, you got lots of stuff about murder trials, you got lots of stuff about sex and money and health. And the result was that by the time of the outbreak of the Boer War in 1899, he was selling 1.2 million newspapers, just the Daily Mail itself, a day, which was far larger than any other newspaper in the world. And that gave him the power to, or at least the money in this case, to hire the best writers. And it was always known that at the Daily Mail you got paid more than anywhere else in Fleet Street, because he was able to get the people who were the best journalists. And that, of course, created a virtuous circle, because more people wanted to read the newspaper as a result. And when you have the Boer War, he would send literally dozens of war correspondents out, and he would expect them to go to the front line, and some of them got killed. And but nonetheless, they brought back the news, unvarnished news, which was very bad for the Conservative government, the Unionist government of Lord Salisbury at the time, because the Boer War had started so abominably badly, largely because of British mistakes rather than South African genius, but nonetheless, it was something that was extremely unpopular in the government, the way the Daily Mail nailed the government day in, day out over not supporting the troops enough. But it made it very popular with the troops, and you saw this again in the First World War.
So he used his position as a brilliant entrepreneur, newspaper entrepreneur, we might say.
Oh, I'm sorry, can I just say, because this is very interesting about the Rupert Murdoch, the big difference between Northcliffe and Rupert Murdoch is, of course, that Rupert Murdoch is not interested in being an establishment figure. Whereas Northcliffe wanted to go to the House of Lords, which he did in 1905. He was the youngest peer in Britain at the time. He was only 40 years old. He wanted to have lots of grand stately homes and important people coming to his coronation dinners and all of that kind of thing. He very much cared about that, and so did his wife, Mary. But Rupert Murdoch, of course, is somebody who couldn't care less about the British establishment.
Though he comes from the establishment, but nevertheless, you're right. His ancestry is Scottish, and he supported Scottish independence at the 2014 referendum. So Northcliffe is, in your book, seen by some as being responsible for the Boer War, or the Second Boer War, because he aroused public antipathy to the Boers and support for the British cause in South Africa. And then, as you describe it, he was really down on the government of Lord Salisbury for its lack of support for the troops who were there. But he was quite jingoistic about the war.
He was. I don't think it's fair. Well, he was an imperialist. He very much believed in the British Empire. Part of the drive that he had was his belief that the British Empire was a good thing for civilization and for humanity, and he was a friend of Cecil Rhodes and Joseph Chamberlain. He didn't go the whole hog in that he didn't believe in imperial federation, for the simple reason that it essentially meant higher food prices, and that was going to go down very badly in elections, he believed. He was proved right, of course, in the 1906 general election, sorry. But he was an imperialist. But I don't think it's fair to blame him for the outbreak of the Boer War. When one looks at the reasons for that, actually there were lots of them, but a primary one was that the Boers were mistreating the British workers in South Africa, in the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, abominably, and the British government here in London were not going to put up with that. It wasn't something that was created. That situation was created by Kruger, not by Lord Northcliffe.
And Kruger launched an attack on the British.
And he attacked them.
So in that sense, they technically started the war.
Well, not just technically, they invaded Cape Colony, and to start a war against the most powerful empire in the world was in itself a pretty suicidal decision to have taken.
They got off to a good start, though.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, absolutely.
So Northcliffe was, let's think about what he believed in. He believed in the empire. He was, I suppose, more of a conservative than a liberal or Labour.
He stood for the Conservatives in 1895 in Portsmouth and failed to get in, which he later considered to be the best thing that ever happened to him, because it meant that he could go to the House of Lords instead, which he didn't actually. He only gave one speech. He had never turned up there, not least because he found that it was completely full of the aristocrats who his papers had been attacking, all of whom pretended they never ever read the Daily Mail, but in fact they seemed to know what was in it quite a lot.
So during the First World War, it's not going as well as one would have hoped, and this affects him very much, as it does everybody else, and he uses his power there ultimately to get rid of Asquith and bring in Lloyd George.
It's the key moment of his life. Actually, in fact, in May, Asquith doesn't fall until December 1916, but in May 1915, Northcliffe learned from the Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, Sir John French, that Lord Kitchener, the Secretary for War, had been essentially sending the wrong kind of shells to the Western Front and not enough of them, which meant that we lost the Battle of Loos in the April of 1915. And so in the May of 1915, on the 20th of May, Northcliffe took the extraordinarily brave, but it seemed at the time completely foolhardy, decision to attack Kitchener by name, the most popular soldier politician of the era, the man whose pointy finger is telling you to join up, and he gets a devastating broadcast attack from Lord Northcliffe. And the immediate result was catastrophic for Northcliffe. The circulation of the Daily Mail, where he wrote the piece, collapsed from 1.2 million to 300,000 overnight. So he lost 3/4 of his circulation. All the advertisers fled. The newspaper was burnt on the floors of the Stock Exchange and the Baltic Exchange. He had lots of people would burn the Daily Mail and put the ashes in an envelope and send them to him. He had to have a policeman protecting him round the clock. It was a truly terrible time for him and the Daily Mail. And yet, as more and more information came through, especially from officers in and men in the trenches, writing to their families, information got past the censors that basically said that Northcliffe had been right, and that they weren't getting shells that could destroy the high explosive shells that could destroy the barbed wire through which they needed to attack. And also that they weren't, that they could only have a preliminary bombardment of 12 hours, whereas, as we know from the first day of the Somme, for example, you need a week. So actually, popularity started to, as this realization came through, to slip back. And by the December of 1916, the circulation of the Daily Mail was up again to 1 million, and he was therefore in a position to launch his attack on the Asquith, the failing, essentially moribund government, liberal government of Herbert Asquith, and brought him down and replaced him with David Lloyd George.
And he was happy with Lloyd George.
He was momentarily happy with
They
Lloyd
had a good relationship for a while.
For a while, and well, whilst when he became Prime Minister, they had a good relationship, but then Northcliffe, who had no idea really about the limits of his power, of how far he could go, partly because nobody in history had ever gone that far before. No, there had been no press magnate who had had that kind of power. And so he was consistently pushing the edges of it, to the point that in the general election of 1918, he told Lloyd George that he wasn't going to support him unless he had a veto over who Lloyd George was going to put in the cabinet. At which point Lloyd George revolted and said and wrote him a telegram from Paris saying, get back in your box, essentially. And then in the April of 1914, Lloyd George denounced Northcliffe in a debate in the House of Commons, and that led to their rift. Before that, what he'd done, rather cleverly, was to send, in the year 1917, he sent Northcliffe to America to be the head of the British War Mission, very important post, which won him a viscountcy and in which he did good work. But the key thing was to get him out of England, essentially. That's why Lloyd George sent him there. And then when he came back in early 1918, Lloyd George made him the director of propaganda in enemy countries. And that was a very important job as well. It underlined the morale of the Germans and the Austrians through various ways that I go into in my book. And in fact, after the war, the Kaiser said that the propaganda against Germany was colossal, and that Britain wouldn't have won without Lord Northcliffe.
By demoralising the German people. It's an extraordinary achievement. We need to talk a little bit about Lord Northcliffe's links here, because this is the centenary of the Royal Charter for the Royal Overseas League from Rossall. And Rossall was founded by Sir Evelyn Wrench. And Sir Evelyn Wrench was, how would you describe him? He was a friend, more than a friend. He was a collaborator.
A sort of factotum for him. Yes, yeah. He was his, essentially a cross between his private secretary, a personal friend, and he made him editor of various newspapers of his. But the key moment came when Wrench recognised that he didn't want to be a newspaperman, that he wanted to do something that was going to be able to bring the peoples of the empire together, and especially people who came from the empire and were in London, that they could meet together as well to coordinate the sort of future of the empire. And so he came up with this idea of an overseas league long before they had this building. And people...
by the way, Lord Northcliffe lived just in the street down.
Yes, absolutely. He lived in Park Place as well. So what they did was they had this extraordinary, very impressive organisation, really, that had its own newsletters and bulletins, and eventually, of course, bought this place as well, and which did allow people to interact throughout the empire on a sort of friendship basis. They had branches throughout the empire, and it was so far as I can understand, the more that I read about it during the research for this book, it was actually an extremely good thing. It wasn't really, the driving force of it wasn't terribly ideological or political, so much as trying to build friendships between people, as I say, in different dominions and colonies, and in London.
And at the end, to provide a particular locality where people from the empire could get together. And still, Roswell is committed to Commonwealth, not so much the empire anymore, but to Commonwealth relations and friendship and a bit beyond nowadays, of course.
I think Wrench and Northcliffe would be very happy, actually, with the way that it's developed. Northcliffe recognised that the empire's days were limited after the First World War, and that the Commonwealth was going to, or a Commonwealth concept, would have to be the next stage, and so the Overseas League, which was as I say, a big organisation by then, always had an important part in his life, and financially he backed it to an extraordinary degree. He was easily the biggest contributor throughout his life.
Northcliffe was.
Yeah.
And he also was a financial supporter of Evelyn Wrench in other ways, because Evelyn Wrench had a very successful postcard business. I think your book says that he sold something like 50% of all the postcards sold in France.
It's extraordinary that
Paris
I still don't really understand how it went bankrupt, because, as you say, he was very, very successful. He started at the age of 19 when he stood at Oxford, and then but later went bankrupt. Northcliffe spotted in him an extraordinary person, essentially bailed him out for as long as possible, and then hired him to do a series of tasks until Wrench, of his own free will, decided that he wanted to commit himself to this dream of the Overseas League rather than be a newspaperman. It also helped that he, at one stage, walked in on Mary Northcliffe, Lady Northcliffe, making love to one of Northcliffe's friends. And they had a very Edwardian, shall we say, sort of aristocratic kind of love life, these two. They didn't seem to mind in the slightest when they had long affairs with people that they knew well. And when Wrench did this entirely by mistake, was completely sort of shocked by it, Northcliffe, instead of being angry with Mary Northcliffe, was furious with Wrench for having walked in. And this was one of the moments at which Wrench thought it would probably be best to go off and do the Overseas League rather than carry on working for Northcliffe.
Yeah. Let me, because we haven't got an eternity, and I want to throw the floor open to questions from all of you, which I'll do in a second. But let me just ask you a couple of more broader questions about what you think. As one of our most eminent historians, there is a kind of attempt to revise the reputation of the British Empire now. We're now told it's something we should be ashamed of. And I have to say to you, I find, yes, no, not revise.
I thought you meant by revise. I thought you meant, yes.
Not revive. I've lived here for 8 years, but I'm Australian. And I am very much a creature of the British Empire, that my ancestors came from Portsmouth and migrated to Australia in the 1830s. And that's a very typical Australian story. So even in my lifetime, when I was a child, the British Empire wasn't seen to have been a bad thing, but its reputation has been traduced in recent years. So what is your perspective of the British Empire? How should we view the empire? The Marxist interpretation or another one?
Absolutely not the Marxist interpretation. No, my strong sense is that the Marxist interpretation of the British Empire just simply doesn't...
It's got a microphone.
Is that better? Have you not been able to hear a word I've said the entire time?
No, why don't we start all over again?
No. Can you hear this, madam? Can you hear me now, madam? At the back there. Okay. My strong sense is that the attacks on the British Empire have gone far too far. They've taken the empire out of its historical context. They assume that we all have, or ought to have had in the 19th century, the same social mores that we do today in the 21st century, which is completely ahistorical and absurd. It strikes me also that the idea that this was just, as the Marxists argue, an exploitative concept that had no redeeming features and was just about trying to make as much money out of the native peoples of the empire as possible, just flies in the face of all of the research that I've done, where I have seen any number of letters and papers and diaries and correspondence of lots of people who worked for the British Empire who genuinely believed that they were helping in the development of the native peoples of the empire. They would not have committed their lives, frankly. They were very Christian, very upright, very impressive people, many of them, and they would not have committed their lives to the British Empire in the way that they did as explorers and tea planters and missionaries and local officials and policemen and so on, wood soldiers. They would not have done that if they thought that they were just doing it in order to enrich capitalists in London. I was born in 1963. I have met many people who served in the British Empire, and they are, many of them, tremendously upstanding people who, as I say, would not have dedicated their lives if they thought that they were trampling down the rights of the native peoples of the empire. So it strikes me that we are still stuck, unfortunately, in a Marxist interpretation which was brought in the 1960s largely in the schools of this country, that does not stack up intellectually or academically and really now has to be fought back against.
So one of the issues here is the issue of technology. I know, because I have had a great deal to do with China over the years, that modern China is very conscious of the fact that it became weak in comparison to the West because the West developed technologies which they couldn't match, and that was the explanation for their weakness, not anything much else. And how that happened is another story. But Great Britain was a technological leader, and bits of Western Europe, France and Belgium and so on, they cottoned on to all of this pretty quickly. This massive technological advantage must have inevitably led to the growth of at least influence of those countries, if not empires.
Oh, well, I think, yes, absolutely. I very much don't want to suggest that the British Empire never did anything wrong. Of course, there were occasionally terrible things that happened, the Amritsar massacre being the classic example. But when one looks at the British Empire vis-a-vis the Belgian Empire in the Commonwealth, in the Congo, the French Empire in North Africa, the German Empire in West Africa, the Italian Empire as well, let alone some of what the Dutch were doing in Indonesia, what the Spanish were doing as well. One recognises that actually having a home country that did have representative institutions was inevitably a huge boon for the peoples of the native peoples of the empire. Because if there was appalling mistreatment that happened, it was pretty quickly brought up in Parliament. Whereas you don't get that in Napoleonic France or Wilhelmine Germany, for example.
There are huge controversies about what we might today term human rights abuses.
But the Chinese labour issue in South Africa, for example, it was an electoral issue in a way that none of these things were electoral issues in the other European empires.
And then, unlike other countries, some other countries, Britain rather willingly gave away the empire.
That's also true. You know, when one looks at what happened in Algeria, for example, in the 1950s, with appalling, incredibly widespread torture that the French metropolitan government imposed on the FNLA, for example. When one looks at some of the struggles in Africa, the end of empire, actually the British Empire, there were terrible mistakes that took place in the northwest frontier in the Punjab in 1947 and 1948, which I write about in my book Eminent Churchillians. But overall, the withdrawal from empire, I think, was something that Britain can be proud of.
And was supported by the government and the winds of change and all of that.
Yes, well, that's right. The Macmillan government recognised pretty early on the way that the winds of change were blowing. And they, and not without political cost. You know, there was the League of Empire Loyalists, for example. There were a lot on the Tory right that didn't like the speed of decolonisation. But overall, seeing it from today's perspective, I think the very fact that we have countries trying to join the Commonwealth that were never in the empire, and countries, even where there was a sort of nasty bush war going on, the Mau Mau uprising, for example, in Kenya. Kenya's in the Commonwealth, and its president has just written a very moving letter about the Queen to Charles III. So you really do have a sense of the best of imperialism ending, but ending in a way that was not a sort of appalling bloodbath like you see in so many other parts of Africa and Asia.
My own observation is over the years I've visited many countries which were once part of the British Empire, that the people there, they have mixed feelings about it. There are some things about having been part of the British Empire, there's an element of it that they see as humiliating, but it's not quite as simple as that. There is a lot of respect still for Britain in these countries, and a lot of admiration for Britain, for British institutions, and for the way they see the British doing things. That admiration is still there to this very day. I've often explained this is a form of huge soft power that Great Britain still has.
Well, one thinks that the Commonwealth has 2.6 billion people in it. And it's an extraordinary size when one thinks of this as obviously a non-military power. But Lord Northcliffe, he saw that by 1922, he saw, which was the year of his death, he died 100 years ago last August, he saw that after the First World War, it wasn't going to be possible to hold the empire in the same way. The bloodletting was so enormous, the loss of treasure in that war was so vast. I mean, in many ways, it's extraordinary that it lasted until after the Second World War.
He died, he was 57, right?
He died, yeah, not far from here, actually. He died in number 1 Carlton Gardens on the roof. He had gone mad. He's got something called malignant endocarditis, which is a particularly horrific illness, a disease of the brain, which unfortunately, because he was such a controlling figure, I don't believe he was an out-and-out megalomaniac, but he was such a controlling figure that when he started to give strange and weird orders to people, because he was actually going mad, nobody acted against any of them, because they just thought he was a sort of mad genius. And so they did what he said. When he finally got to Boulogne railway station and shouted at the rather bemused French railway goers that God was homosexual, they did finally get a doctor who was able to work out that he was dying and mad and dying. And there was a rather unfortunate moment where he waved a revolver at one of his doctors, that also, but they later discovered that his attendants had taken the bullets out of it. But what they did was to build a shed on the roof of number 1 Carlton Gardens, and that was where, because he needed to cool air, and on a particularly hot summer, and that's where he died.
Is number 1 Carlton Gardens the house that the Foreign Secretary knows?
Yes, absolutely, yes. And Liz Truss actually very generously allowed Michael Gove to live in it, and it was Michael who showed me the part of the roof that the shed had been built on.
Right. Why don't we throw it open to you, to some of your questions. You don't have to ask questions just about Lord Northcliffe, but about, or Rossall, but about anything to do with history at all, or politics that you might wish to say at the back.
There's a mic.
Yeah, we have to use the microphone.
Andrew, very good talk, but could you just refresh my memory? Was he still alive in the 1930s and responsible for the Daily Mail supporting Oswald Mosley with that famous headline, "Hurrah for the Fascists"?
No, he died in August 1922, 100 years ago, so long before Adolf Hitler came to power or was even thought of as a major political figure.
Who was responsible for that quotation when the Daily Mail was launched? A paper for newspaper boys written by newspaper boys, or something to that effect.
That was Lord Salisbury. It wasn't a headline. It was something that was said against the Daily Mail by the then Prime Minister.
Even though it was Tory supporting.
Even though it was Tory supporting, yes. It was a sort of snobbish remark.
Right.
Yeah.
But actually, one point here, though, in relation to the Daily Mail, if I've got this all completely right, is owned by Lord Rothermere. And he is the current Lord Rothermere, is the descendant of Northcliffe's brother.
That's right.
Harold.
He's the 4th Viscount, and his great-grandfather was Harold Northcliffe's younger brother. Yeah.
Nailed it. I got it. So it's still in the family.
Very much.
And
In
it
fact,
is
he's
a
just
privately owned company.
Yes, they've just bought back the shares, so it's more in the family than it was this time last year.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to pose a question, what if? I know Lord Roberts likes that. Specifically, if there was no Lord Northcliffe, would there have been sort of different figures who would have acted collectively or perhaps during a separate time to have that kind of revolutionary effect that one person had? And also the intrinsic relationship that politicians and bursts in the press, such as this gentleman had, and the intrinsic relation between the power which they shared. And this is what we started off with as well. The relationship remains so close because the transformative effect that this kind of fast media could have.
Yes, that's a very good question. Northcliffe himself was, as I say, the person who led this transformation, but it was happening anyway. It was being called the new journalism. There were other leading journalists of the time. W.T. Stead was one of them. 3 or 4 of them, they're mentioned in my book, who were sort of tiptoeing towards this. But Arthur Pearson as well. But they didn't have the capital that he had. The great thing was that because of his magazines, his million-selling magazines, he had the capital to be able to do for something quite extraordinary. For example, when in 1896 the Daily Mail was founded, it had no fewer than 60 dummy runs. So for 2 months, they went through every process apart from the actual printing of the papers in order to check that everything was right, with regard to the telegrams and the distribution and the way that the printing machines worked and so on. What also he was able to do, because he was so rich, was to buy all the latest technology. So he was able to churn out newspapers at 3 times the speed of any other newspaper, which meant that he could get them also further around the country earlier. And people with the news, want the news early, as they always have done and always will do. With regard to your question about politicians, although as I mentioned earlier, he enjoyed the sort of high society life and loved having his homes and his tremendous wealth, and he'd have Paderewski play at his dinner parties and so on. He didn't actually like politicians as a breed. He thought that they were essentially untrustworthy.
So you said he went mad in the end.
And so, because they were able, because he had seen in his life various politicians who he had put great trust in, Winston Churchill being an example, who had let him down, or at least he felt had let the empire down in the Dardanelles catastrophe, which he was the first person to, along with Keith Murdoch, in fact, to denounce. He very much thought that it wasn't good for him to be close to politicians because friendship might corrupt his ability to tell the truth to his readers, and that was always more important than friendship, which meant that he fell out with absolutely everybody in his life.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I have a question about your previous book on George III. As a Yankee, I obviously took a dim view of him until recently. Now I take a dimmer view of his ministers and the various compadres that he had in government. How did the British establishment get it so wrong? The American Revolution question. You say something to the effect of that not until appeasement in the 1930s did the British establishment get it so wrong. So how did they get it so wrong?
Golly, that's a big question.
Good question.
I think there are quite a few components to it. In a sense, they saw, rather like we were talking earlier about the Commonwealth, they saw the American colonies, the 13 American colonies, as being incapable of self-government. At a time when, of course, America actually in the 1770s had 8% year-on-year growth. They had 2.5 million people. Philadelphia had as many bookshops as any other any other city of the empire apart from London. And it was turning into, and by the 1770s was, a place that was capable, especially if you're united, of becoming an independent country, especially once the French threat was removed in 1763 at the end of the 7 Years' War, what you call the French and Indian War. So that was the key moment, and the British establishment, as you put it, just didn't spot that. Completely failed to, and as a result, they passed the Stamp Act and the Tea Act and the Coercive Acts and all the rest of it, assuming that America was just not going to be in a military position to do anything about it, and we were proved very, very wrong within about 18 months.
Thank you very much.
And George III is still seen by Americans, American school children, and as being some sort of vicious dictator.
That's right. Well, he was until my book was published. Yes.
Yes. Well, it's quite a popular perception of the Americans.
Unfortunately, yes. I subscribe to something called Google Alerts for King George III, and so whenever George III is mentioned in any American newspaper or website, it pops up. And not a single day goes by without him being called a despot or a dictator or something equally completely unfair.
He was a kindly old man.
And a true believer in the glorious revolution of 1688. There's a lady in the front.
Yes,
Can we
I'm
give this lady?
not sure why you're walking backwards.
There we are.
I've been trying to indicate down.
Here we go. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to go back to the beginning of Rossall. Who else, apart from Sir Evelyn Wrench and Lord Northcliffe, were involved in setting up Rossall? And also, who influenced its ethos? One of the reasons why I'm a member is because I believe women were members from the beginning. Is that correct? And wasn't that quite advanced for the time?
It is correct. It was advanced, and it was something that Northcliffe very much believed in, because he had seen how successful it was to sell newspapers to women in the 1890s.
So he made money out of women.
He had a newspaper entirely staffed by women at one point, the Daily Mirror. He had women's pages in all his newspapers. He couldn't understand why 50% of the population was not being catered to at all by the established papers. And so one of the secrets to his massive financial success was that he was always in favour of having women writers and so on. So that was his stance, and he and Wrench definitely put that into the founding documents, I think, of Roswell.
And who else was involved?
It's in my book. I'm afraid I can't remember all their names at the moment.
Right, just time for... Well, we've got time for 3 more questions.
I find it very interesting that he owned both, well, in today's terms, there are 2 left-wing newspapers and 2 right-wing newspapers. Was that the case when he was in charge, and what kind of political influence was he trying to wield by having such a disparate group of newspaper interests?
He had different political agendas for different newspapers. The Daily Mail was his own political opinions and prejudices, and he was a very prejudiced man. I don't want to make him. He was a great men are not always nice men, and there was a lot about Northcliffe that was profoundly unpleasant. He was anti-Semitism as a classic example of that. And so, this is no attempt. My book is in no attempt to whitewash this man. There are lots of things that he would break people's careers as soon as look at them. But when it came to his newspapers, he allowed the Observer, for example, to oppose the political views of the Mail. He didn't impose his political views on the Times until years after he had bought it. The Mirror was on the left, and he didn't mind that. It was a pictorial paper, and it was a way of him working out how photographs, all the extraordinary things that were going on in photography at the time, could alter newspapers. And so he wasn't somebody who imposed his own political opinions on everything he owned by any means. And if he had, he wouldn't have been able to have created that circulation. So he was a lot smarter than that.
Right, we've just got time for a couple more questions. Yes.
If you had the choice, which one of your biographical subjects would you like to have dinner with, and why?
It's Churchill every time. It really is. It has to be.
All right, excluding Churchill.
All right, excluding Churchill, Napoleon. And actually, for the same reason in both cases, they were so funny. The jokes were just came thick and fast with Churchill, of course, but also with Napoleon. Extremely humorous man. This was one of the things that came as a slight surprise to me, because lots of British historians have always made him out to be a sort of proto-Hitler figure and so on. He wasn't like that at all. He was actually Hitler never told a joke in his life. This man was Napoleon was a funny man. But I would right now, I know we're going having dinner afterwards, aren't we? But I would chuck you, Alexander, I have to say, at the last minute, I'm terribly sorry, and I would chop off my little finger in order to have an evening with Winston Churchill.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much. It's a fascinating talk. It's a rather cheap question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there anything that, from sort of late 19th century and early 20th century history, that helps us make any sense of what's happening politically today?
By today, you mean in the last week? No. I don't know. No, of course, listen, British political history, especially over that kind of length of time, is full of crises. You know, it's actually extraordinary. I think one of the things that's interesting is how quickly we forget how crisis-ridden our history is. Actually, I mean, we've lived through several political crises. This is the latest. There'll be more. It's important to get to be calm, of course, and to get a wider historical context in these things. You know, we can remember lots of crises ourselves, and then you go back to the period you mentioned, the early 19th century. I mean, let's have a look, just for example, at the period before the First World War, when we have this sort of idea of sort of L.P. Hartley kind of idea of people sipping teas on lawns in the lovely summer sunshine of 1913. Not a bit of it. 1913 was riven by massive industrial strikes. It had the suffragettes doing the same thing as the Stop Oil campaign is doing at the moment, attacking paintings in the National Gallery and so on, letting off bombs indeed on one occasion against Lloyd George. It had deep social unease. It had nearly a full-scale civil war in Ulster. It had, of course, the dangers and the fears of war, the expense of the dreadnoughts that meant that we couldn't have the sort of social reforms that the Liberals had promised. We had people attacking each other physically in the House of Commons. Winston Churchill had blood drawn when an Ulster MP threw ironically enough, the Procedures of the House of Commons book at his forehead. You know, it's always been like this, and you know, that's not a bad thing in a democracy. Far better that than a country which has no opposition at all, like Putin's Russia today, and then occasionally has a revolution.
I was really struck reading your book, actually. I mean, this is your book on Lord Northcliffe, by the number of political controversies, the upheavals, the rows that there were. And I was thinking exactly what you've been saying, that it's always been us, hasn't it? So I've used the chairman of the meeting, prerogative, not the chairman of Roswell anymore, but the chairman of the meeting's prerogative to ask you the last question, which is one we were discussing at university last week, and that is that there is a perception, and I'm not sure if the perception is a reality, that the reputation of politicians, and look, we know Lord Northcliffe didn't think very highly of politicians in his time, but the reputation of politicians has declined. People think less of the political class now than they did before, yet politicians are better educated than they've ever been, and there are more women in politics than there have ever been. I suppose you wouldn't draw the conclusion that because there are more women, the reputation of politicians has declined.
No, certainly
So,
not. No, I would not.
It's just a joke.
I would, no, I think...
Because it's so obviously not true.
A couple of things. Firstly, I think that it's not just politicians. In fact, when you look at the statistics, the trust in all sorts of people have declined, apart from actually clergymen, especially clergymen, recently, but clergymen, businessmen, even estate agents who never had a particularly high level are very minor. So it's not just politicians. I think that we've had a general decline in trust in our sort of professional classes. Anyhow, don't ask me why that is, but it's true. So I don't think that politicians should be singled out. All the politicians I know, every single one of the politicians I know, and I do know quite a few of them, have gone into politics for the right reasons, because they genuinely want to make Britain a better place. And I think we ought to remember that occasionally. You know, they don't do that grinding work for extraordinarily low amounts of money, frankly. in order to wield power. It's in actually a lot of them I see as rather sort of glorified social workers, essentially. And so you have that, and at the same time, you have a social media that is so vicious and so hateful and so coruscating and corrosive to society that what we're asking people to do is to present themselves and their spouses and their children to be excoriated day in, day out on these loathsome platforms, what my friend Neil Ferguson calls the universal lavatory wall. And that's another reason that enough of that seeps through into the public imagination to make politicians unpopular. So I think it's probably a time to buy stocks when it comes to politicians and try and bump it up, because no society, no democracy can survive long if all politicians are constantly reviled. Let's look at some of what it was like in Germany in the early 1930s, what it was like in Russia in 1914 to 17. When everybody hates all politicians, very bad things happen.
Yes, that's a very good point on which to end, because I noticed, by the way, in opinion polls that young people, sort of under 25-year-olds, increasingly are disillusioned with, in this country, disillusioned with the institutions of democracy and wonder whether democracy is worthwhile. And 45% of young people think that. They'll grow out of it, I suppose, but it's nevertheless worrying.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's absolutely wonderful, my lord. For
I'm getting used to it.
Yes, I'm helping you to get used to it.
Thank you.
For giving us such a wonderful hour. I think you'll all agree it's been absolutely fascinating, not just about Lord Northcliffe, but think of all the other books that Andrew has written, including a history of English-speaking people since 1901.
Absolutely.
Which is a very good book, but you quote me in that book, so I like that book.
Thank you very much indeed. That's very kind.